Here at Be Freaking Awesome, we believe that life is too short to be anything less than extraordinary. Join us as we explore what it means to live authentically, grow continuously, and have a blast while doing it. Let's get started. Welcome, everyone, to today's episode of Be Freaking Awesome. I'm one of your hosts, Amy Kinnison, here as always with Angela Belford. And today we are joined by very special guest, introduced for the first time as Dr. Jessi Brewer. Jessi, thank you for being with us today. I'm so excited for this conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, before we let Jessi introduce herself, I just want to kind of set up this episode. And this is going to start with a little bit of a networking tip, which is when you meet somebody, especially in a professional networking environment, go to LinkedIn and connect with them. And when the connection is had, then you send them a note, or maybe even when you connect with them, put an email to them, little inbox, little note on LinkedIn. It was so great to meet you at blah, blah, blah event. Because I did that. And 2016, Angela is super happy that she did that because recently I saw Jessi's post on LinkedIn, so compelling, GED to PhD. And I was like, oh my gosh, how do I know her? And I click and I go to send her a message and say, I want to have you on my podcast. And then it showed me how we knew each other. We had met at an event in 2016. So Jessi, Dr. Jessi, I'm so glad to have you here, and exciting to reconnect. And why don't you go ahead and tell everybody a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. First, thank you for that tip, because I will say that I used to tell my students that all the time about LinkedIn. And I remember meeting you. We did a lot of, I used to work at the University of Arkansas, and we did a lot of social innovation work and work with the Entrepreneurship Hub. And so I was always meeting these incredible speakers like yourself. So yeah, it's great to connect, and I'm so glad to have that point of connection. So my name is Jessi Brewer. I'm actually an Arkansas native, so born and raised. I'm currently based in the Boston area, but I spent the first half of my life in Central Arkansas and then the second half in Northwest Arkansas. I'm proud alum of the University of Arkansas. Both my bachelor's and my master's in English are from that university. And yeah, I've spent the last 5 years really digging into a lot of research through a doctoral program about the social impact of literature, specifically in prison education, and thinking a lot about, the emergence of the modern penitentiary. And I now work at a Boston-based nonprofit that works to support the education and advancement of currently and formerly incarcerated folks. So very passionate about education and very passionate about literature. And there's a lot of ways that those two things intersect in my life, which I'm sure we'll get into. But that's, a little bit about me, and I'm excited to be here and chat with you.
What's cool is that when we reconnected, we discovered that we both went to high school about 8-10 miles apart from each other. So when she said Central Arkansas and she told me Damascus, and I was like, I graduated from Quitman High School. That's crazy. Yeah. It's just right there. Anyway, so that was very cool. And there's so many things in your introduction. Like, oh my God. Excuse me. You have a PhD in 19th century literature, which led you to prison reform work. What?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, connect that dot. Connect that dot for us.
How did that work? Well, actually, it's actually quite interesting because people think, so I'm a Victorianist by trade, which is 19th century British literature. That's my area of expertise. And what's really interesting about that is that many people don't know is that the modern penitentiary, so the prison systems that we know today, emerge out of the late 18th and early 19th century prison reform movements. So the idea of prison as the punishment itself is a new concept. It's a modern concept, right? It's a post-19th century system. And so what better way to think about the, prison system than to go to the source, to go to that moment in history where there's a turn of the tide, essentially, and they remake the prison. And so I was trying to be a Victorianist in one hand. I was doing like literary stuff, and I was actually doing work on the side with an organization called the Brandeis Educational Justice Initiative. And they had a reentry program. And so I started working in that space and meeting a lot of people who were coming out of prison and I was doing it separately at first, and then the more literature I read in the 19th century and the more like social theorists and philosophers and all these people in the 19th century were kind of all talking about prison and like the logics of incarceration, we call carceral logics, right? So surveillance, policing, prisons in general. And I started to notice that so many prison abolitionists talk and think about that time in history. So that's sort of how it started. I was like, oh my goodness, there's this huge connection here that often people don't write about or think about. And I want to say one thing, which is that it's not prison reform, because there's a difference between prison reform and prison abolition. And prison reform is about reforming the current system, and prison abolition is really about the current system can't be reformed because it's inherently broken. So it's really about prison abolition and how does literature and the literary imagination help us think outside of this normalized punishment system that we currently have. So that's kind of how it started.
I love that. And when I think about my own journey, and I was just sharing with someone twice in the last couple of weeks, I was able to share my equity journey and how when you don't know, you don't know. And right. I own my privilege that I just didn't recognize systemic racism for a long time. And once once I was exposed to it, my first response was, that's too hard to fix. I'm going to work on homelessness. Like I literally actively chose to ignore it until I landed in the seat of executive director of the Housing Authority. And then you're one of the keepers of the systemic racism. And so then I really had to re-engage in a different way. That process has opened my eyes to how the abolition of slavery led to the modern creation of the prison system and forced labor and still continuing. So while the actual institution is new, it is in my mind slavery.
It's an evolution of a different system.
Absolutely. I think modern day slavery is what a lot of people talk about with the prison system. And I would say, in the civil rights movement and even pre that, people found ways to criminalize Black and brown people. I mean, that's essentially what that, post-slavery or Reconstruction era did. It found new ways to capture people and put them into cheap or non-existent non-paid labor. And that, I mean, the prisoners that are, or not the prisoners, but the people who are currently incarcerated, many of those folks are also working for next to nothing. The firefighters in California, there's all these stories that we could talk about the way that modern slavery works. So absolutely. And it's interesting that you say that moment of kind of the recognition of systemic racism, because I think I didn't really understand much about the prison system, even though, because you and I are from a very similar region, even though most of the people that I knew growing up had been in prison. So I come from, as Angela mentioned, Damascus, Arkansas is where I spent most of my childhood, and everyone I knew was in prison. My uncles were going to prison, my cousins were going to prison, people I knew in and out of juvenile detention. And that was so normal. I didn't understand that isn't normal, but it actually is normal because the U.S. incarcerates, more people than almost any country in the world.
Well, especially when you've criminalized drugs, which drugs
absolutely.
Are just used as a tool to numb our pain, and we don't deal with our mental health. And so, of course, we're going to use drugs it's going to put us in that system. And then once you've been in the system, then getting out is excruciatingly difficult. And actually in my equity work, I do, there's some policies that I think that the U.S., that's not why I invited you here today. Thanks for that little side philosophy, wander down the path.
Before we come back up the rabbit trail, I want to ask one question. I imagine listeners and people who are sort of learning with us might be asking, if we abolish prisons, then what? Which I realize, and I think you were alluding to that, our creative thinking can help explore options. can we talk about that for a brief moment? And then we're going to
I
jump to
would
what we're
love
actually
to.
going to talk about, because I don't know that, I was like, I think that there are a lot of people who are like, I can't imagine doing anything
Yes.
different. Therefore, this feels crazy to talk about. And so
Feels
anyway,
almost wasted. Like this is a waste of
yeah,
time.
and
Yeah.
I don't, and I'm sure that you probably get this a lot, and I don't mean it to sound as like, well, what else can you do? But
No, I love this
what's the
question.
response to that?
I love this question, and thank you for asking it, because everyone thinks it, right? When you
Yeah.
hear prison abolition, people think that is such a radical idea. And
Yeah,
I don't
you just
mean
want
that.
to let murderers wander the streets
Yeah,
and
this
pick
is-
up our children? Like, what are we doing?
Exactly. The biggest question that we get, the biggest question that circulates in this conversation is, what about the murderers and the rapists, right? And
Yeah.
and there's like defunding the police and public safety, and there's all these questions, and I think we should address that, because I want to talk about what prison abolition is. It isn't just the abolishing of systems, right? Prison abolition is a political vision that, with the goal of eliminating those larger punitive structures, but it isn't about just absence. So let's tear everything down. It's also about presence. And this is what a lot of great abolitionists talk about, like Angela Davis, Ruth St. Gilmore, like all these big abolitionists, they talk about this. It's presence, which means what can we build instead, right? It's about reallocating funds that are punitive in nature into things that are focused on community-led solutions, right? So if you go and cause harm in your community, there are ways in which we can think about how do we create, and I'll talk about a few examples, but it's about accountability. So there's still accountability, but it's not putting that person, in a cage for the rest of their life, but thinking about what are the options for rehabilitation, restitution, reparation, because prison doesn't offer any sort of closure or healing for the victim either. And people miss that part, right? Which is like, if you send someone to prison, or that person is often not able to take accountability. Our court systems are set up to, if I, cause a harm and I go through the judicial process, I can't ever say I did this and I'm sorry, right? I'll get more time. There's all kinds of ways in which the prosecution will kind of get you for that. And I've spoken to many men and women who haven't ever been able to own their offense until parole, right? 20, 40 years later. So there's all kind, and it's just such a big topic, but I want to really emphasize that presence is about building communities. There's many prison abolitionist organizations out here doing work that focuses on solving the pressing social problems in their community that both prevent crime and that both deal with the harm in their circles. So restorative justice practices, thinking about, completely decarcerating people who are dealing with addiction and giving them other types of services. Many people who are serving life are often go when they're, not even adults. So 17, 18 years old, and they've been in for many, many years. And there's all kinds of ways I think that prison abolition, just as a political vision, allows us to imagine something different, right? It doesn't have it. And it's curious because it hasn't always been this way. And this is a new modern way of doing, prison is a new modern way of dealing with social harm. And in fact, I want to mention this as well, which is up until the 60s, 70s, 80s, people, even in the South, were being commuted at really, really high rates. So people also had furloughs. So the permeability of the prison wall was very open. So you could go into a prison more freely and see your family, touch your family, hug them, not behind a plexiglass, not behind like a video call. And governors had sometimes hundreds of commutations, right? So the expectation was that you wouldn't spend your life in prison, even if you'd committed, a horrendous crime. You would probably spend 10 or 15 years. And if you'd been rehabilitated, you would get commuted. And now we have over, 5,000 people serving life in the United States, whereas in the 1980, it was like 500. So the incarceration rates are growing, especially in Arkansas, actually, who has like higher incarceration rates than anywhere else in the U.S.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
So we only have 3.5 million people, and a lot of them are the taxpayers are actually having to pay for them to be housed?
Incarcerated. Yeah. So I think it's like 912 out of 100,000 people in Arkansas are currently incarcerated. And we lock up a higher percentage than sometimes almost every country. So like we're internationally, our rates stand out in the state of Arkansas. And just as a quick aside, because I have to say this, and it's growing, right? Our governor is trying to build a new prison in Franklin County and add 3,000 more beds. So the focus on Arkansas really is harsher sentencing, more incarceration, more prison when we have really high crime rates. There's no correlation between prison and public safety.
So
sorry, I know I just said a lot.
No, this is so good.
I get very excited.
sometimes when I'm here and I'm like, oh man, like I guess it's talking too long, and I'm like, when do we interrupt? And I'm just like wrapped. I'm like, I'm here, I'm in it. Like I'm learning, I'm absorbing. And other people are feeling that energy.
You're right, Sammy. It is a lot. And I really want to tie it back into, I think my first response to systemic racism is, oh, this is too much. But what I love is that, Jessi, you're so full of hope. And that hope comes from your own story. Because wait, what? GED to PhD. let's tie this back in. Like, how did you do that? How did you navigate a really interesting and difficult childhood, riddled with poverty and riddled with such connection to the prison system? And then, if you can kind of help us get to where you got. Yeah.
Well, it's, I was a homeschooled evangelical kid in the South, and I'll start there, which means that education looked a little bit different for me. So I went to public school until about 4th grade, and then we were pulled out and homeschooled for religious reasons. And through that religious education, we didn't have any sort of, I'm going to call it like real education. So there wasn't any social studies or American national government or math or English or anything like that. It was really kind of almost if I wanted to learn something, I could go to the library and read it, but there was no there was no structured education. And so by the time I was 15, 16, I couldn't do long division. I had never written a paper. I had never, I felt like people around me were speaking a language I didn't understand. Many of my friends at church would talk about things, and I would be like, what are they talking about? And I couldn't quite figure out, what I knew something was missing, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what exactly it was. And thankfully, I was a very avid reader. And through a couple of really great novels as a kid, I remember thinking, oh, like education might be important. There was one novel, it's Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It's a 19th century novel. This is where my love of the 19th century comes from. And that character goes to school, right? And education was her like way out of the situation she was in. And so I thought, oh, like there might be something here. I also read Frederick Douglass's The Life and Narrative of a Slave, and he talks about, in particular, education as the tool, right? The oppressive tool. So if you don't have access to this thing, then you can be oppressed in this way. And that was like a key way in which his life changed. And so I thought, there must be something here. And I started working as a teenager and paid for a tutor, caught myself up to high school level. My goal was to just go to high school. I was like, I want to be with my friends.
Wait a minute. I'm sorry. I'm going to interrupt you because I find this like, if I were listening to this podcast, I would like, now hold on, wait a minute. What in the world? Who taught you? Who even made you think about reading Jane Eyre? Because Jane Eyre, sorry, I wasn't forced to read it in high school. I think I had to read it in college, and I forced to read it. And so I'm like, why would you actively choose that? And like, what?
Yeah.
And who picks up Frederick Douglass, The Life and Narrative? There's something
as a younger teenager,
as a 15,
16-year-old.
I mean, I read all the dystopian stuff Sammy had to read in her little honors English classes. They hurt my brain, but you were not getting that. Were you hearing about it from friends? And they like, what, why, how did you figure out to read those books?
Well, I picked them up purely by accident. I will say, thankfully, my mother loves old books, and she had a giant bookshelf that had a bunch of stuff on it. In particular, a whole shelf. Yeah, exactly, a whole shelf of encyclopedias. And I remember actually learning a lot in the encyclopedias, like when I was bored. I mean, we lived in Damascus, a town of less than 400, homeschooled. There was nothing to do, and we were home all the time unless we were at church. So my options were like play outside, which I did, but you get bored. And I think I was just, I had loved to read as a kid in school. And I'm so grateful for great teachers who really instill that love of reading. I feel like if people do nothing else, if you just teach your kids to love to read, there's so much power and potential in changing their path in life. There's all kinds of research about literacy and kids reading at an early age. So the more you get your kids to read, and as someone who teaches and has taught college for a really long time and freshman writing, I will say students who do really well are avid readers, right? They're people who really love to read. And so I think I just kind of,
I was like, I want to add, the Fayetteville Public Library has a really cool program specifically for this, that we went to go sign up our children for summer reading programs, and under 5, they don't have a summer reading program. They have the 0 to 5 reading program, and it's the goal to read 1,000 books before kindergarten. And you have to have been read 1,000 books. And so you get a little booklet. Every 100 books you read, you get to come in and get a prize, and they mark it off, and there's coloring pages with it. But it's based on the research that having exposure to reading in that 0 to 5, literally 0 to 5, they're like, you can start this with your infant baby who, at some point they do start to understand it, but questionable understanding of what the words are, but you're exposing them to the words and things like that. So even like programs like that are really great to look into, and you might get a little rinky-dink prize to go with it. So